What is going on, Diesel Nation? We're excited to have you guys with us today on the Diesel Podcast. If you're watching this on YouTube and aren't subscribed, make sure and click the subscribe button, like, comment. Let us know what you think about the episode. If there's a particular topic or guest you'd like to have on the podcast, we're always checking comments on YouTube and love to hear from you guys and then make future episodes out of your recommendations. Today, ATS Diesel Performance is going to be on the podcast, and they're going to be talking about transmissions and 3 things that can destroy a stock transmission, lead to a rebuild, things you can do to avoid them, or if you're already in that position, ways that you can make your transmission stronger and hold up, whether you're using it to work hard every day, tow, haul, or if it's something that's more of like a street build, something that's making a bit more power. So it's going to be a great conversation. Before we get to it, though, I want to remind you our friends over at Kershaw Knives have a 20% off discount code for you. Just use code 23diesel20 at kershaw.kaiusa.com. It's a great way to save some money on some really cool gear. If you need it for hunting, fishing, EDC, something to use at work or around the house, they've got a bunch of new models for 2023. Their Duralock are the latest. The blade uses D2 steel. It's got a really sweet opening mechanism. Keeps your fingers away from the blade when you open and close it. And they have a bunch of different styles and different blade shapes as well. They've got a ton of other knives. So if you're into knife collecting or need something very specific, they got a bunch of different opening mechanisms, blade steels, handle materials, and they've got some really nice price for any budget. So if you need something to be able to use really hard, or if you're a knife enthusiast and are really into different types of knives, they definitely got you covered. So make sure and use code 23diesel20 at kershaw.kaiusa.com. All right, let's get to today's podcast with ATS Diesel Performance and talking about transmissions.
What's going on, Diesel Nation? This is ATS Diesel Performance, and I've got Phil and
Howdy.
Whitman here joining us today.
So, Mr. Whitman, who are you?
I'm Whitman Taylor. I do all the Allisons here at Dan's. Everything from our basic street builds all the way up to our Comp 2 builds and all of our performance valve bodies.
Okay, so how long you been doing this for?
I've been doing the transmissions here, the Allisons here, for about 2.5 years.
All right. What do you think of it?
It's fun. It's definitely enjoyable. Get to see some cool builds come in and go out, and namely one Monster Max. Both transmissions in Monster Max are 2 of our street dominators, so that was definitely a cool project.
Indeed, yeah. So as far as Allisons go, give me like the 101 on Allison transmissions. What's some strengths, weaknesses, just basic stuff?
Well, the Allisons, they're great towing transmissions. They hold up fairly well until you start to add power, and that's mainly when we see our builds come in, our orders for our builds come in. And, they're a great, like I said, they're a great towing transmission. It's just they need a little bit of upgrades when you start to put power to them. And
So what's like the threshold? How much power can you add before you're starting to face some problems?
I've seen stock ones hold up to about 500 horse. Anything past that is you're on borrowed time.
I'm impressed. 500, that's solid. Would not recommend
No,
running
definitely
it
not.
at 500. Just because it can doesn't mean it should. So at what point then do you think someone should start thinking about getting their transmission built, or just go for it and pull the trigger?
If you're looking to do some upgrades to it and you're wanting to get it tuned, you're wanting to put a big turbo in it and fuel to it, that's when you definitely should look into getting it built, because you put all that money and time into it and you go out and have fun with it one night and you're left with third gear.
Ah, yes.
Or no gears.
You have several neutrals now. It's not good. So basically, if you're planning on doing a bunch of power adders or kind of a whole build, you should definitely put the transmission in the mix there.
Oh, most definitely.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think 500 horsepower is usually that line. Once you get near that level, it's time to start doing some upgrades as far as the transmission, because you got to be able to put the power to the ground. Also, turbocharger, injectors, all that seems to top out right around 500 horsepower. It's like, yeah, you can really lean on it in tuning and get a little bit more out of it, but then you're asking more than those injectors are made for. You start spraying outside the bowl, and you could crack pistons or some break crankshafts. But yeah, as far as the Allison goes, the 5-speeds, they seem to give up a little easier than the 6-speeds do. There's some changes in the forward drum on the 6-speeds, make them a little stronger. When the LMLs came out, they had a dual-sided clutch in the torque converter, so it could handle a little bit more power there. And it also had the ability to adjust line pressure electronically or by putting an EPC fooler in there. So the LMLs, the early L5Ps with the 6-speeds, they can handle a little bit more, but still that 500 horsepower line is when you want to start thinking about upgrading that.
Sure. Okay. Now, let's say even if you're under 500, let's say you just want to kind of bulletproof your transmission, like if you're consistently towing a really heavy load, or let's say racing or pulling in a stock class, something along those lines, you could still do some work to your transmission, correct?
Yeah.
Is it necessary, or?
Some little things you can do, like on the 2001 to 10 trucks, you can do a Transgo Junior shift kit in the valve body and some shift springs. That'll help the transmission shift a little faster and apply more pressure to the clutch packs. As far as the pump and converter, there's not a whole lot you can do unless you actually pull the transmission out to pull the pump apart and put a stiffer spring in there for more line pressure, or change the converter for a multi-disc converter. But at that point in time, you might as well just build it because it's already out apart. The LMLs, basically, the same with the L5Ps, the early ones. You can put an EPC fooler in there, which basically deletes the electronic pressure control solenoid. It just keeps it at max line pressure all the time. It's a little over 200 psi. Give most the clamping force to those clutches and converter. There's also electronic boxes out there that you can use to manually turn up the pressure, or transmission tuning. Some transmission tuning does that as well. Basically, all it does is turns off the EPC, so it's full line pressure all the time.
Okay.
But you can also do a deep pan. It gets a more fluid capacity. So if you are towing up a steep hill or something, there's more fluid available for that transmission to keep cool, and just takes longer to heat up. So that does help.
Oh, makes enough sense. So let's say I don't feel like getting my transmission built, right? I like my stock stuff. Let me just keep it stock. What can I do to keep things happy in stock form? How do I prolong the life of my stock transmission?
A good thing to do is obviously keep on top of maintenance, filters, and fluid changes. Make sure everything's topped off and there's no leaks. Common leak point is the transmission lines, and I've seen actually transmissions run low because of leaks. Just keeping your transmission cooler free from blockage. You get grass and dust in there and garbage, and it doesn't want to it takes a little while to cool down. Obviously, if you're towing through mountains and stuff, watching your trans temps, usually a good indicator is 100 degrees above ambient temperature is really where it should be running. If you're running 200 degrees constantly, I mean, that's obviously an issue, but just keeping up on top of maintenance and just making sure everything's running correctly.
Maintenance and keeping an eye out for things. That makes enough sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I remember correctly, there are 2 filters?
Yes, there's one inside the pan. That's your main sump filter. That filters anything that's in the fluid. That filter goes, or the supplies fluid to the pump. And then from there, the fluid goes either to the spin-on filter, which filters out very fine particles that goes to the valve body, or it goes to, the rest of the system. So either, creates your mainline pressure, goes to your converter, goes to the transcooler, which then the fluid that comes from transcooler goes to lubricate all the bearings and bushings. So, those are the two filters in the system.
All right. Makes enough sense to keep those clean then. Now, let's say I've got my stock set up and I'm feeling a little rowdy. I want to put in a drop-in turbo, maybe a little bit of fuel, but maybe I don't want to touch my transmission yet, which is apparently not a great idea. What is the first thing? What's the most common thing that's going to go out first when I put too much power through my stock transmission?
I usually see when I get cores in and guys have put in a turbo or done some tuning and they've had some fun with it. Most common is C1 clutches in the forward drum, and then the C3 clutches. And C3 clutches from the factory have a lot less oiling than the rest of the clutches in the whole system of the transmission. Most of the time, the C3 clutches are the most common ones to go out. The C1s are also very common. That and it's the like I said, the oiling is lacking for the C3 clutches, and that seems to be the most common issue when guys start to add power.
So when I machine C3 plates, is that where I'll see heat marks from?
Yes, that's exactly where you see the heat marks from. The clutches will slip and create hot spots on the top plates, and basically all the steels inside that clutch pack look practically the same way. And by machining those clutch plate or those top plates, you allow an extra set of clutches to be added to that stack. So more clamping force, and yeah.
Cool.
I'd say an issue on the 2001 to 2010 Allisons is the piston return springs for C3 and 4. They had springs that pushed up against the apply plate that goes up against the piston to return the piston back to home when it's disengaged. The issue with that design is it would cause that apply plate to warp a little bit, and that would take up clearance needed for the clutches when they're in the off. So it would cause them to drag, and that produces more heat. So it can cause premature failure. On the LML transmissions, they went to a different design where it's got this big ring that goes around the apply plate and puts pressure directly on the piston. So instead of putting pressure on the apply plate where it could warp, it goes right to the piston. So that improves the clutch clearances when the clutch is off, and does improve oiling as well because you have more clearance in there. I'd say on the 01 to 5 trucks, I used to see a lot of C2 clutch failures, which is engaged on 4th and 5th gear. So if you overpowered 5th gear, P0 735, most likely it's going to be C2 clutch that started to slip. Sometimes it would be C3, just kind of depends what the transmission felt like giving up that day, I suppose. On built transmissions, sometimes we see the C2 clutch drum splines strip. If a guy's doing, boosted launches and that shift from 3rd to 4th, sometimes that'll strip the splines, or if you get a situation where you lose traction, like maybe you hit like a bridge joint, and lose traction. That can cause a shock load and strip the splines off on the C2. So we do see those failures.
So it sounds like most of the common problems that we see are friction related, clutches, friction surfaces, and then the splines on the drum. There should be quite a few of those, right?
Oh yeah,
But even still, I mean, everything lets go at some point.
yeah. The issue is the hub itself isn't thick enough. So when enough torque is applied to it, it'll actually balloon out, and that's what causes it to strip. So then you wreck the drum and your planet.
That's not good.
No. So
It helps to keep those intact.
Yeah. So they got billet drums and billet planets. We typically will use those in some of our higher builds, but
Okay.
it takes care of that issue.
Now, on the subject of a built transmission, what different levels of build do we offer, and who needs what kind of built transmission?
So our builds, we have 3 different builds. We have our Street Series build, our Street Dominator. We have a Comp 1 build and a Comp 2. The Street Dominator retains all its stock shafts. Obviously, the clutch upgrades and pressure upgrades there, valve body upgrades, cooling upgrades with the pan, and converter, our Garand triple disc converter. That's good for about 750 horsepower. Obviously, you got to, if you're throwing a turbo and injectors and some power at it, that's a good all-around street trans. Our next build is our Comp 1, and to that we add a billet input shaft and a billet output shaft. That's good if you're going to the drag strip, racing it. So if you're putting a shock load on it, you're not going to snap your tail shaft, and you got a nice billet tail shaft.
Done that a couple times.
Yeah. And then you have your billet input shaft in that as well. And then that's 850, 900 horse. And then our Comp 2 build, that gets a billet input shaft, billet intermediate shaft, billet tail shaft, billet P2 planetary, P2 planetary, and then billet C2 hub and billet sun gear. And that hub that Dan was talking about earlier that likes to strip out, that's a fix to stripping those hubs out. It basically it's harder. It won't strip out as easy as the factory shaft or the factory stub shaft on that planetary, and the splines in the hub are also harder. So that's a good upgrade for guys that are really putting power down and beating the crap out of the truck every single day. And I mean, it's good for about 1,000 horsepower, more, depending on how far you're going with it. That all of them include our most popular builds. They come with the Garand triple disc converters. And obviously, if you're looking for a higher performance truck or a bigger charger, you go with a bigger stall, depending on what setup you got going.
Okay, so torque converters are something I'm a little unfamiliar with. I know there are several different options, but what are some common options? What does each different one do that others don't? What's your preference for whatever application?
So we use gear-end converters. They've been really good to us. We've been using them for many years now. The most common converter that we pair with our transmissions is the DK converter. So it's a billet stator triple disc converter. It's got a stall speed of around 2,000 RPM, which is good for pretty much daily driving, towing, mild street builds, like if you have a 64 or even a 66 mil turbocharger on there. It's a good all-around converter. The next one up that we keep in stock is a K converter. It's got like a 2,700 RPM stall. So if you're in the big, 68 or 72 mil turbochargers, S400s. It's going to help spool the turbo better, but it also drives very nice on the street. And then, you get up into the 3,000 RPM stalls like the J and the AR. Those are, for sled pulling, drag racing, competition level trucks. They also offer a bolt together version, so you can take the converter apart on a bench, restall it. You can change the clutches, rebuild it. So if you're racing or sled pulling, and let's say you got an issue with the converter or the transmission has an issue, and you need to go through it, make sure everything's all good inside, or you need to, restall it, whatever, you just put it on the bench, undo all the bolts, pop the cover off, and do what you need to do, replace the seals and put it back together. And they also have extreme clutches for those really high horsepower torque load applications. So
sounds like a convenient thing to have available, especially if you're beating on your torque converter all the time.
Mm-hmm. They also have a X converter, which is like 1,800 RPM stall, so it's a little bit lower than factory. And that's really good for towing. If you need to utilize that low end torque for pulling heavy trailers or hot shot and things like that, that converter works really well for that. It's also good for daily driving. So, yeah.
Okay, this is an option for everyone.
Yeah,
it sounds like.
Yeah, it really just depends what you're doing with the truck and what your horsepower goal is.
All right. So now we've got our torque converter options. We've got our build options. Let's say I'm going with a nice street build. Got my street Dominator. Mm-hmm. Got probably about a factory stall speed converter. And I'm feeling adventurous. I want to put the transmission in myself. Do you have any advice for me?
The biggest thing I see with guys trying to put them in themselves is obviously being able to support the transmission, getting in and out. But there's a few things that people miss. Basically, you have dowel pins that align your bell housing with your backing plate. I've seen a lot of cores come back with the dowel pins still in the cores. So that means their new transmission did not get dowel pins. Basically, being able to flush the transmission cooler, especially if you had a failure before putting it in, you have metal in the transmission cooler. And when guys come and pick them up, I always go over with them and they say, oh, I'm going to use brake cleaning and shop air and a rag. Blow it out that way. And that won't get everything out of the cooler. You need to have some sort of hot flush or a professional flush machine go through the cooler, or just replace it. I mean, that's the easiest thing. And the transmission cooler on the radiator is also a spot where stuff collects.
Yeah, I'd say most of the trash is caught in the heat exchanger on the radiator. So if you can't get the cooling system flush with a hot flush machine, just replace the radiator and transcooler. Hey, might as well upgrade the lines too if you haven't yet.
Yep.
Because all the trash that's going to be in that cooling system, that's lodged in there with that old dirty fluid. Once you put that new transmission in there with that new fluid, you fire it up, all that trash is going to basically get dislodged, or a lot of it will be, and it goes right back into the trans. And that trash goes to the lube system. So it's going to go to all the bearings and the bushings, the planets, and whatever doesn't go to the lube system goes right back to the sump side of the pump. So then it goes right into the pump and right into the converter. So
what you're saying is all that crappy leftover transmission juice goes right to all the vitals of the transmission.
Yes.
That's a problem. Clean out your lines, kids.
I'd say we've had a few warranty claims. The customer installs a transmission and right off the bat, it doesn't shift right, or maybe it's throwing shift solenoid codes, which is basically stuck valve codes. A lot of it can be derived from not flushing out the cooling system. It's the quickest way to ruin it.
Yep.
aside from not putting fluid in it.
So after I pick out my transmissions, Whitman builds it. I get it delivered to me. I decide that I'm going to put it in on a Wednesday night in my only vehicle that I have to drive to work the next morning. I wrap it up about 3:30 a.m. and I may have made a couple oversights, and now it's acting a little funny. Well, I'm going to probably want to file a warranty claim, but what does our transmission warranty actually cover?
Our warranty covers the transmission against defects in parts and workmanship for 5 years, unlimited miles. So if we made a error in assembly or machining of the transmission, if there's an issue with a component like maybe a clutch delaminated or a bearing was put in upside down or something, anything on the assembly side of the transmission, we would take care of it. But that's pretty rare. We have a really good track record with build quality, and the parts quality has been really good too. We use Alto clutches and choline steels, all Allison gaskets, seals, electronics. So really don't have too much for warranty claims. And a lot of the ones that do get submitted are from installer error.
Even shipping error too. We've had a couple lately that have shown up with broken bell housings and stuff that way, from basically leaving our shop to its destination.
Yeah, that's why we like to ship our transmissions in crates. So it's a nice big plastic crate. The transmission secured inside with straps so it can't move around. But we do have customers that ship them in on pallets because they want to avoid that core charge. And if it came in on a pallet, then it's going to be going back out on a pallet, because otherwise we have to ship that crate back. So it's just extra logistics and costs there. But yeah, the shipping companies really don't give a fuck about your shipment.
Yes, the golden rule of shipping is assume that they're going to throw it off the top of the tallest building they can find. Pack it like that, because it doesn't matter what it is. I used to work for a shipping company that I think is probably best if I don't name. And there were plenty of times where I saw people playing kickball with packages. So just pack it like you want it to survive the apocalypse, and you'll probably be okay.
I'd like to see somebody play kickball in Allison.
That'd be something. That's too much for me.
Yeah, I've done my fair share of strapping transmissions to pallets. We use the heavy duty plastic straps and crimps. And I've even given them the slap and said that's not going anywhere. And a few days later, you get an email from the customer and with pictures showing the transmission is upside down or it's got a broken bell housing or something, and it's like, how the heck,
Right.
So
You even said it's not going anywhere.
yeah,
Right. That's the magic word.
Yeah, usually it is.
Yeah. Shipping is an odd business. Better safe than sorry, especially with something so valuable.
Another thing is when you install a transmission, you want to have a good scanner like a Tech 2 or GM MDI. I know some Snap-on scanners and those high-end scanners will do it also, but be able to reset the taps and the presets in the TCM, go through the quick learn procedure. What that basically does is you get the transmission warmed up, and the TCM will command each clutch pack to engage on and off, on and off. Then it'll engage each gear selection. It'll also imply the torque converter on and off a few times. And basically what that does is it establishes the response times, the fill times for the pistons and the clutch engagement, so that once it's done with that process, then you can take it out, start driving it, and the TCM has a better idea of what the transmission's doing, what the shift times are going to be like, so it's not going to be flaring or banging, and it just speeds up the learn process a lot faster, because that TCM remembers the old transmission, So the wore out clutches or the old fluid or low pressures, if there's an issue, the TCM remembers that, and back then it was constantly making little changes to kind of compensate for, a failing clutch or internal leak or something like that. And you apply those same settings to a brand new transmission, it's not good. It can actually cause damage to the transmission. So
That is definitely not good.
No.
I know I've seen at least seen some odd behaviors out of truck with either a new transmission or a new TCM that hasn't had that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, probably best to be prepared.
fluid, that's another thing. Years ago, Allisons used to just get Dex 3 fluid, and even on the newer transmissions, we were using Dex 3 fluid for all of our builds. And then, when the later transmissions came out, Allison had a service bulletin about switching everything over to Transcend, which is like a Dex 6. It's a synthetic fluid. And at some point in time, they changed the seals and the pistons, the rubber compound for some Dex 3 fluids that don't really get along with those compounds. It would actually start to eat away at the rubber and causing internal leakage, and then clutches would start to slip. So all of our transmissions use Transcend from Allison, or you can go to like Advanced Auto Parts and get Castrol Dex 6, which is pretty much the same thing, or any good Dex 6 quality fluid is what our transmissions take. I think it's 5 gallons. Is it 5?
Yeah, I usually recommend 22 to 23 quarts at least from a fully dry system. And then obviously with our builds, they come with a deep pan, so that's another couple quarts right there.
Yep. So you'll put 3 gallons worth in the truck and then start it, and then continue adding fluid until it reaches the middle of the cold line, and let the transmission warm up. And the fluid should come up to the middle of the hot, especially after you do the relearn and whatnot. Yeah, all those clutches that gotta fill up with fluid, the pistons gotta fill up too.
So basically, you put a little bit in to prime it, make sure it's not bone dry.
Yeah, you don't want to put it all in because then it'll start coming out the vent.
That's not good.
No, it makes a mess.
I could definitely imagine 23 quarts, just yikes.
Well, I think where it's like if you do it on like a 47 or a 48 RE, like a Dodge, those vents are in the bell housing. So if you overfill it, on your initial startup, and it'll start dumping fluid out of the bell housing, so you think like, oh, you messed up the pump seal or something like that. So it can be frustrating if you think that you did that, you pull it all apart and find out it's perfectly fine. Like, no, you just put a little too much in there and it had nowhere to go.
I've been guilty of that at least once.
Oh, I would lose it because I would be that guy. I'd be like, oh, I broke my transmission, pull it all back apart, go over everything with a fine tooth comb, and then be like, well, I actually just added half a quart too much. I'm an idiot.
You'd be on the phone at 8 a.m. like, hey, my transmission's having problems. It's leaking fluid all over. Where's it coming from?
And then you have that moment of realization, like, yep, that one's on me. Mm-hmm. Have a nice day, gentlemen. So sounds like there's so many options here. Upgrades, swaps, all that sort of business. I see we also do 5 to 6 speed conversions. Well, what does that entail?
We don't do it very often. So the 2001 to 5 trucks came with a 5-speed. And when the LBZs came out in 06, they had a 6-speed. It's all the same internals as far as the planets and the clutches. The only main difference is the valve body and the TCM. So there's a couple kits out there that put a different valve body in and a TCM calibration that enables 6 gear. which is C2 and C4. And it'll make it a 6-speed transmission. And the idea is it'll lower your RPMs when you're cruising, so you get better mileage and less wear and tear on the engine and stuff like that. But you're stuck with the transmission tuning that comes with it. It's not an editable, modifiable program. So if you also take this truck sled pulling or drag racing, you can't retune it to do a second gear start or bump those shift RPMs up so you can utilize the turbo and whatnot. So you're stuck with the system the way it is. And as far as fuel economy savings, it would take 150,000 miles of driving to break even on the cost of the kit. So, once we start explaining that to the customer, it's not really worth doing.
Now, is this? It sounds like this is kind of a tune-in process. It sounds to me like you're basically adding in a 6th gear with tuning. Is that about right?
Yeah, when Allison was going to come out with the 6-speed transmission, they were going to use the original AL5 trans controller to shift that transmission. Well, then GM and Allison changed course and went to the A40 TCM, and therefore there was this operating system created for the 5-speed or the AL5s, and it just never went into production. So, that's the story behind that.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So you can add an extra speed just with a couple of parts and some tuning.
Yeah, it's just a different valve body, the way the channels or the hydraulic fluid is routed, and the calibration in the TCM.
Huh. It's kind of clever, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Shame it doesn't work better. It sounds like a great idea.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of more speeds, the newer transmissions, I believe, have 10 speeds.
Yeah.
What year did those come out?
Those came out in 2020 with the new body style. And everybody's still learning about them. There's a couple companies out there that have been making some parts for them. But they're still pretty new.
Yes, that is not too long ago, especially in terms of aftermarket. What sort of upgrades are there for those that we know of, or any potential failure points, stress points, anything to keep an eye out for?
Well, there is a couple options out there for different torque converters. Ratio Tech does have a shift kit for the valve body. There are some billet parts coming out slowly but surely, but in the grand scheme of things, there really isn't a whole lot else available right now. Clutches are still in development. Maybe there's some out by now. I'm not sure. I haven't really kept up on that. But yeah, I know a lot of the overdrive clutches, when they're overpowered, will have issues. There's a drum in there that's made out of aluminum that tends to get eaten through by the steels. So, they have their weak points for sure. So hopefully that transmission will be figured out here with some good upgrades in the near future.
All right. And if I remember correctly, because the L5P engine is pretty stout from the factory, the transmission's also fairly stout too.
Mm-hmm.
But again, as you add power, you kind of have to add reliability to the other parts.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the transmission tuning, that just became available within the last month, I think. Up until now, there was no adjustments for shift points or pressures or anything like that. So I'm sure that's going to help the longevity of a stock transmission quite a bit. I have a 2020 and a 22. I tell you what, I like the 10 speed. For towing, it's a great transmission uh, with the much closer gear ratios. It keeps the engine in its peak torque range. It's really smooth. It's really a nice transmission. So
One thing I hear a lot about, not necessarily the 10 speed in the trucks, but just kind of the higher gear count transmissions in general, is a lot of people tend to say that they go gear hunting. It'll try to go from 8th to 4th or whatever. Do you find it does that excessively? Obviously, if you're cruising in 10th gear and then suddenly you floor it, it's going to downshift pretty far. But do you find it unusually high?
no, I don't notice any problems at all in my trucks. Both mine are pretty much stock, except for a Banks Derringer and Pedal Monster, and a DPF back exhaust and intake. So, no, I mean the TCM commands the gear that's right for the load, throttle position, engine RPM, and depending on what speed I'm looking for, it'll pick the right gear for the job. If you're on flat and you start coming up to a hill, it'll downshift one gear or two, and it just pulls right up that hill, no problem. So, but yeah, as far as like gear hunting, I haven't had that problem in my truck or either one.
Well, sounds like a pretty standard operation then.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's good.
Yep. So, a couple of things I wanted to add on the Street Series builds and the Comp 1, that C2 clutch drum, we do have a machined sleeve that we press onto that drum to basically double the thickness of the spline area. And we machined the sun gear out to allow clearance for that sleeve, and that bulks up the drum so it doesn't balloon and strip the splines. So usually if there is going to be a failure, it usually snaps the snout on the P2 planet, but at least you can go a lot further in power or abuse before that happens. It's pretty rare. We don't see that too often, but that was our little fix for the ballooning of the drum.
Yes, I believe I just finished a run of sun gears.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nice process, fun process,
Mm-hmm.
a little messy, but the finished product is quite nice to look at.
Mm-hmm. Some more information on the LML and early L5Ps. As far as modifying the line pressure, we talked about the EPC plug. So what the system does is there's a solenoid that controls pressure going to the top side of the mainline pressure regulator valve. So the more pressure that the solenoid sends to the top side of the valve, the more line pressure the system will make. And from the factory, the line pressure goes to full, for a shift, because it wants to make sure that shift is quick and it's got good clamp. But after a couple seconds of being engaged, that pressure drops down, and that's when you can overpower the clutch pack and start slipping. So by putting a EPC plug in there, it just deletes that solenoid and puts a solid plug in there, so line pressure is full all the time. We have had a lot of people ask, well, if I have an EPC plug in there and I get trans tuning that's got raised pressure, is that could cause a problem? And the answer is no. The system can only add so much pressure, but before the system's maxed out. So whether you deleted the EPC, the solenoid with the plug, or you tuned it out with the tuning, it's going to equal the same result. It's the same amount of pressure going to the top side of that valve. It can't double or go any higher. So that's how that system works.
Okay, so it's the ceiling of the pressure is the same either way. You can
Yeah.
just adjust how fast, how long it stays at the ceiling.
Right. Basically,
Either
with
way.
the plug or trans tuning with pressure, it's just making the line pressure max all the time, and which is perfectly fine to run. The transmission loves it. The cooling system handles it just fine. You might see trans temp go up 10 degrees above what you used to see, just because the more pressure, creates more heat. So that's to be expected, but the cooling system handles it just fine.
Yeah, all things considered, that's not too big of a change in temperature.
No. So,
Well, gentlemen,
I don't think there's anything else to talk about.
I'll probably think of something as soon as we shut off the recording. I'll ask Whitman off mic and then forget to mention it.
That's it. Broken output shafts. Like I said, I've done that twice. On my first truck, Mistress, the first time I took that truck, it's an 05 crew cab short bed. I took that to the drag strip. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I made a second gear launch tune, and I was probably third time on the track. I just boosted the shit out of it. And as soon as the light went green, I stomped it, and all of a sudden I heard this big bang, and the truck shook and didn't move. It was stuck on the track. We had to push it off and push it back to the pits. And I was trying to figure out what happened. And, as you put it in park, well, everything inside is still spinning. Just the output shaft's broken. So it just does that grinding sound. And it's like, okay, what that doesn't sound good at all.
The keys in a blender noise. Ugh.
Well, the thing is that this was probably about an hour from the farm. So and that was my ride there. I drove it there. So I had to call my friend Jeremy and like, hey, my truck's broken. Could you bring the Fonz and the gooseneck up to pick me up? And so he came and picked me up and dropped it off at the farm, brought it in the shop, and pulled the transfer case off, and the stub from the output shaft fell on the floor. Like, well, there it is. So
That'll do it.
And the thing is, I did tail housing. Well, I pulled the tail housing off to do the shaft in the truck. I didn't feel like pulling the transmission back out. So I remember just jacking the rear end way up. This is before, I had a lift. We're talking 2009, I think, is when this happened. I had a bunch of cinder blocks and a jack stand sitting on cinder blocks. I had this truck at like a 45-degree angle in the shop, and it worked. I just pulled everything apart and swapped the shaft out with a billet one and put it back together. So
what you're saying is we've come a long way.
Well, yeah, now we use a 4-post lift to do that on. So
That's a fun failure to have, huh?
yeah, I mean, the right way to do it is to pull the trans out, stand it up on its bell housing, so all the bearings and clutches and everything just stay right where they're supposed to. Pull the tail housing off, pull the shaft out, put the new shaft in, put it back together, and spin the shafts, make sure there's nothing bound up.
I see a lot of guys on the forums post that they crack their tail housing and try to do it in the truck like that, and they can't get it back together. I've gotten a lot of cores back with bearings that are just exploded because of that.
Did you see the guy that put his transfer case up and then pulled the tail housing off? And all the guts inside were pushing on it. He couldn't get the tail housing back in. He couldn't get the transfer case out because it was bound up with the torsion bar brace.
Yep.
So I've seen a lot of fuck ups, but I have not seen that one before. I don't know how to help you on that.
Yeah, exactly.
They pull the cab, I guess. I don't know.
I've never actually worked on a transmission, transfer case, any of that. This sounds like a nightmare. Mm-hmm. I do most of my work in my driveway. I would not want to do that in a driveway.
No, it's not fun. And the thing is, you have to have the transmission vertical or mostly vertical. Otherwise, the Torrington bearings will pop out of their grooves. And once that happens, you put it back together. It it detonates when you fire it up and try to move it. So yeah, it's important to, if you're going to replace a cracked tail housing or if you got a output shaft issue, just pull the transmission out, do it right, stand it up, and
I'm always cautious when I see a core come in and it's got a brand new tail housing on and the rest is crustier than shit. Like, I hope nothing's screwed up in here because I know somebody did this in their driveway with a jack and silicone to seal it back up.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys mentioned that because I would have been that guy. Like, oh, it's just the back end of the transmission, just pull the back tail housing off, throw something new in there, and call it a day. And then keys in a blender.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I think that's about it for this episode.
Yeah, I'd say we've covered most or all of what we need to cover.
Yeah, a lot of good information. So
if you guys have any questions, give us a holler.
Yeah, shoot us a message on our fan page. We'd like to maybe do like a Q&A session sometime talking about, truck builds or products that we make and offer. So yeah, hit us up on Facebook or Instagram. You can shoot me an email to info@dancedieselperformance.com. Or you can always give us a call at 815-977-5865.
And check us out on TikTok too.
Yeah, we're on TikTok. And
we're some comedians. We are very comical.
there's some interesting things on there.
Indeed.
So, all right, well, thanks for listening.
All right, adios, ladies and gentlemen.
Don't forget, Diesel fans, make sure and head on over to kershaw.kaiusa.com. Use code 23diesel20 for 20% off site-wide. It's a great way to save some money, get some really cool gear if you need a knife for hunting, fishing, EDC. Definitely head on over, check out their website. They've got a bunch of knives to really meet any budget that's out there. Their 2023 lineup, they've added a bunch of new knives this year. The latest is the Duralock model, which is really nice. I've got a few of them myself. The blade is D2 steel. And the way that it opens is super sweet. So I really like that part of it. And there's a bunch of different handle materials and shapes, designs. So definitely got something for you. If you're in the market, definitely make sure head on over and take advantage of 20% off site-wide. I also want to give a shout out to some of our Patreon supporters. Tyler Loewen at 23 Diesel, J. Cole John, all of our other Patreons, all of you who subscribe on YouTube, podcast apps, follow us on social media. We appreciate your support here in year 7 of the Diesel Podcast and look forward to bringing you more great content in 2023. Until next time, keep the shiny side up.